design as a word needs to be everywhere. It needs to be brought much more into education, into schools. It needs to be an everyday word. It seems to be very precious instead of actually being part of what we do.
Hello and welcome to Things I've Learned, a podcast from Mix Interiors, the show in which we explore how the inner worlds of designers, architects and creatives shape the world around us. I'm Harry McKinley. Someone at the UK's Design Council once told me, you don't make a case for building a bridge by counting the number of people who swim across a river. As they explained, we often set out terms for success based on what we already see happening, not what we don't see. We rarely ask who is not swimming the river, but needs a bridge. I thought that was a magnificent analogy and actually an important message because it got me thinking about design that meaningfully works for all of us. It made me think about who we haven't been seeing. Our ability and our willingness to engage more people in the conversation then is perhaps what will allow us to build a design industry and a world that is truly inclusive. This episode, I'm thrilled to be joined by Iris Dunbar, director and founder of the Interior Design School. Iris, you've had a truly remarkable 50-year career in the design industry and have been instrumental in shaping how we view interior design as a discipline. You're a former president of the British Institute of Interior Design, and today, of course, you're helping to train and nurture the next generation of design talent through the Interior Design School. Rewinding slightly, you were also the first qualified interior designer employed by the global design practice BDP back in 1972, one of the first women to occupy a leadership position in the field. So tell me, Iris, when it comes to the design industry, why do you think it matters that everyone is given the opportunity to have a seat at the table?
Well, I think the perception of interior design is something that is not really seen the right way. Every time I go for a coffee or a drink and say I'm an interior designer, everybody immediately thinks residential design. But of course, it's a vast area of discipline. Every place we go should have been designed by an interior designer or architect, or at least be considered. And I think I've spent my career, and I sometimes think the conversations I had at college are very similar to the conversations we have now, which is why should people be questioning the fact that design is one of the most important aspects to any environment.
Do you think it's important that we have that diversity of perspective? Since you started out 5 decades ago, we now live in quite a different world. Did you face any particular barriers, for example, coming into the design industry?
The barriers were sort of the lack of, within the construction industry, I think it was seen that interior designers or trained interior designers didn't have the capacity to understand the building the same. It's all to do with thinking that we were decorators. People immediately think of residential when you think of interiors, because of course everybody is an interior designer. They move a chair, they paint a wall. They have control of their own environments. But the actual aspect of understanding how an interior works and how the building works is really key to the whole process.
And does having more types of people engaged in that process lead to better design?
Well, I think one of the aspects that I learned in the process was that creativity belongs to everybody. And, we as a design profession tend to think that we're the best at everything instead of actually spreading it out a bit. And in fact, every client, everybody has the right to a creative thought. And our profession is about collaboration. The collaboration stretches further and further. And I think going back to when I was working at BDP, we thought we were the bee's knees, really. Aren't we wonderful? We're interior designers. We should be in control of it. But in fact, we have to listen more. And the design disciplines, of course, specifically for an interior designer, we have furniture designers, textile designers, product designers, graphic designers, architects. The actual expanse of design input into any project is quite amazing, and people don't recognise that.
Well, you've achieved a lot in your career, Iris, and I'm sure there are plenty of people that think you are, in fact, the bee's knees. We're going to talk a bit more about your journey and your pathway to success in a moment. But before that, a word about our season partner. As a podcast listener, you understand the importance of great sound quality. So does Impact Acoustic, and that's why they've made it their business. Impact Acoustic create bespoke, design-led acoustic solutions for commercial spaces. They also know that, as a designer, you care about the planet. That's why Impact Acoustic's diverse range of products are not only beautiful and functional, they're also designed with sustainability at their core. For more information on Impact Acoustic, visit impactacoustic.com. So as I mentioned, Iris, you've achieved a lot. And I wonder then if it's perhaps difficult for you to pinpoint the particular milestones that have led you towards success. But as we enter our first chapter, tell me, what does success mean to you? And I'm curious if you had goals back at that point in which you entered the design industry, and if you feel you've perhaps achieved them.
It's a really difficult question. Personally, I don't particularly feel successful. Looking at what you achieved, how do you gauge success? And I suppose one thing that we don't do when we're younger is actually set out things that we want to achieve or ambitions. You sort of get on with things. So more than goals, it was probably irritation that people didn't really understand our profession. And, every client or every conversation I would have, people would say, what do you do? Oh, I'm an interior designer. And I made sure that I said, but I don't do residential, it's commercial interiors. And always had a story that could help people actually think differently about it. So even asking a question, when was the last time you were in a doctor's surgery that you felt really bad and being in the reception area made you feel even worse? I think my goal was to change people's attitude to what their environment was. Helping people to be aware of the environment was probably the underlying goal I've always had throughout my career.
But because so much of your career has been about changing perceptions when it comes to interior design, I'm almost thinking, going back to those early days, how did you even determine that you wanted to go into this field? Because there's the old adage, you can't be what you don't see. And of course, there was really no one else doing what you went on to do. So how did you even set that up as a viable career ambition?
Well, I suppose, going back to school, I wanted to keep doing art at school, and I was told no. I had to do science, and I succeeded in failing all my science exams and hung on to doing art and got into art school. You sort of go towards what you're good at, don't you? There was a department called Interior Design that had just started, and they talked about studying space, light and colour. And I didn't want to be an artist, but when they said light, space and colour, I thought, gosh, that's a direction. That's what I want to do. And these sort of strands come through any interior of analysis. And I think the questioning in our profession is what makes us move forward and not accept things as they are.
What was your first professional experience of success, and what did you learn from it?
Well, I think that's a good question. One of the first projects I worked on at BDP was a stockbroker's office in the city, and not a very glamorous project at all. But once you sat the people down and said, how do you work? Are you left-handed or right-handed? What's the environment? What kind of environment do you want? And, by the time I'd finished, they were happy with what they had. And I think, one-to-one, when you actually work, not necessarily with the client, but with the users, and actually help them to understand more about their space and how they can actually enjoy it rather than just be in it.
So now, of course, as an educator, you're really hands-on with the next generation of design talent. But going back, you were really a pioneer just by being a woman in the field.
When I was working in a team, and I realised now that I was the only woman, but I wasn't aware of that, really. I do think that there has been a shift, obviously, over the years in terms of education. Architectural schools have still got less women than men. However, the interior profession tends to be more women. And I think, I'm not sure whether or not people shouldn't see it that way because, you're dealing with people. Everybody's the same. So I don't feel as if I was a pioneer.
Well, there are plenty of young designers out there who would disagree with you. How does it feel to be someone that is looked up to in that way?
I love the fact that I can help. I mean, the whole aspect of education and even talking to people at the BIID or just having a conversation about our profession and how I do believe that as a profession, we don't stand up and shout enough. And what I try to do is to sort of build people's confidence. I really love doing that now, is actually mentoring or keeping people on the straight and narrow as to what they can do. That's partly one of my successes, is seeing people that I've taught winning awards, which is fantastic.
And of course, through the Interior Design School, you really are engaged with nurturing and mentoring that next generation of designer. What do you teach them about success and the pathway to get there?
I think the realisation that their ideas are not just part of them. The whole process of working with a client, understanding that creativity belongs to everybody, the conversation, the dialogue that you have with your client, because the aspect of success of a project is about everything that you've put into it and the sort of clarity of thinking. I've learned a lot about understanding to stop and think, not to rush into things, ask, for students coming up, spend more time on the brief and the narrative and how you can communicate your ideas. The actual communication of the idea is very important. And people have got to have confidence in their whole thoughts. And actually, there's so many different aspects of an idea. Why should your idea be better than the other idea? Actually, the analysis of the brief and the thinking about the project is so important. And a lot of people, as designers, and specifically students, rush in to come up with an idea that they think is wonderful and produce an image. And it's not about the image, it's about the reasoning behind and the consideration of how it's going to work.
It's wonderful that you're able to impart these lessons on a new generation of designer. But who did you learn from coming in? Who was influential for you?
Well, I think, at college, the tutors, they didn't build our confidence. And I think that's why when I started teaching, one of the main things was to build confidence and build people's approach to it. And I think, I don't know who I got that from. I suppose when I was working with Rodney at BDP, we actually all, as a group, communicated really well. It was all about discussion and going forward rather than just owning an idea. I think understanding that design is a collaborative process is actually really good for your confidence because you're then able to speak out a little bit more.
What have you learnt about collaborating successfully?
You have to trust who you're actually working with. Everybody has got a say, but you have to stand up for yourself. Also, when you're thinking about an idea, not just think of it for the sake of it. It's got to have foundation. And then the collaborating process is all about building that trust between whoever you're working with, whether or not it's a graphic designer on a project or whether or not it's an engineer. But the dialogue must be on the same wavelength. And when that gets broken, then it doesn't work.
For me, one of your greatest successes has been in changing the whole way that we think about interior design as a discipline. in bringing this recognition that actually it can be a rigorous, credible profession. It was almost taking interior design from the domestic into the professional space that I think has been a really important part of your legacy, if we want to call it that. How was that journey for you?
Yeah, well, I suppose when it does go back to when I was training, in that it was an interior design diploma that I was working with, and it was between the School of Architecture and the School of Design. So we'd be in the textile division, we'd be in the architectural division. So it always became a fight to be able to get people to understand what we did. You know, it wasn't superficial. We're not just putting a chair in place. You know, you have to go behind the scenes to make something work. And I suppose I've never thought any differently. You know, when you think about the profession, commercial interiors has existed, but it's been led by architects. And in other countries, it still is. You know, in Japan, interior coordinators have not got the sort of drive that we do in our country. So it's important for us as a profession to be able to teach our clients that it's a much bigger picture, and asking questions to a client. How long are you going to be in this building? Not just let's get a quick fix. It's the depth and the foundation, and looking at how that can actually work, which I find probably from the beginning that I've been thinking.
Well, as a profession, you've gone on to hold some of the most influential positions there are. You're a former president of the British Institute of Interior Designers, as I mentioned, a former president of the International Federation of Interior Designers. Now that you have all of these notches on your belt, are you content with the success that you've achieved, or perhaps what are you reaching for next?
I don't think I'll ever be content in that process. The BIID has gone from strength to strength in the last decade or so. The International Federation, I mean, you can see how people are changing their thinking. I think the recognition of our profession is getting better. I believe that there's new things happening in education. There's a new apprenticeship scheme that's being thought of, and I do believe that is a very good route into our industry. I think for kids in school to understand what our profession is about. You know, so I think there's a lot of work to be done.
Are you going to be part of that work?
I hope so, yes.
So let's talk about failure, Iris. How do you define failure?
What is failure? You know, when you're designing something, you're looking at lots of different routes, lots of different ways of doing things in the planning aspect. If you choose the wrong route, is it a failure, or is it just another possibility? I think people don't recognise the fact that an interior is never static. It's there to live through different variations. So if something's not right, it can change. It will change anyway. You know, so change is at the heart of design.
So this idea that failure can just be a different route, something to kick us in a different direction, is a very positive way of considering failure. But of course, some designs just don't work. They're not fit for purpose. So how do you gauge that?
When it comes to interior design, the failure can often be in miscommunication. The designer has got a specification for something, the contractor can't get it, there's a miscommunication, and that is probably one of the biggest aspects of a failure within design. And it can produce things that don't work, things like the chair in the restaurant is at the wrong height, lots of things that come down to bad design because of lack of communication. But when it comes to me personally, I think I probably would have liked to have been able to be more of a business person. Failure in not being able to get the books right, or you know, the documentation and you know, all that aspect. I think I've failed to achieve a very successful design practice. I went into education. I have definitely succeeded in the educational aspect, but I didn't succeed in design practice.
When you say design practice, do you mean doing something of your own or working within a practice? I mean, was that ever an ambition for you to have, Iris Dunbar designs?
Well, after BDP, I did set up a company called the Yellow Pencil Company in the 70s. Through partnerships not working, it didn't work out. It hurts a little bit because I look at a lot of the top design practices and think, well, what would have happened if I'd been one of them rather than an educator?
What did you learn from what didn't work out? In confronting that failure, did it teach you anything?
It taught me to do something different. And I actually...
Well, you just said, maybe it's not failure. Maybe it's just a different route.
A different route. And I do think that one of the aspects that people come into a career thinking that's going to be the only career, but, we change, and the flexibility that we have to sort of do what we want or do what makes us feel better. I must admit, the educational aspect of teaching people to get the facts right before going on site and all these kinds of things have probably come from me not doing it the way I should have done it.
What would you do differently if you could do it again?
I think I'm quite happy with the route that I've taken because through that route I've actually met designers in different countries. I've opened up my thinking about what design could be and should be. Whereas if I was in a design practice, it becomes more insular. And I do think I try and get different designers to be more involved with like the BIID, IFI and all that kind of thing to open up thinking so that people can actually understand more.
So you've taught the next generation of designer about how to avoid some of those pitfalls, but what would you teach them about confronting failure itself?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question because in an educational situation, there's always the crit, which when I was looking at this, I was thinking, it's a terrible word, a critique, It should be an analysis rather than a critique because everybody's got a different opinion. So I know going back to some colleges, that they can just ruin people's approach to things. You have to build the confidence of an idea. You can't just throw it out. You've got to sort of think, well, why did you do it that way? Let's look at that. And also, point out that if you do fail in that, then you've learned something. You've learned that that's not the way it should be. And that's very much at the base of how we design, is learning from and analysing what's gone before. And then you can see where the direction that you can go. But it might not be perfect. And I think that's one of the things that it's having a go and making sure that you're not just throwing out an idea, but you've done it in a considered way, that everything's been questioned.
I think that point about criticism really resonates with me. I went through an arts university and sometimes was subject to quite harsh criticism, but not always constructive criticism. And it sounds like that's something that you've really learned to navigate. So what do you think is constructive criticism? How do you approach that?
Well, if I'm faced with a project and the student runs through it and, it might be quite obvious to me a shift or a change that could be made to the project. But before actually going through that, anybody that's looking at it, you've got to stop and think. You've got to think before you actually give the answer to the student. You've got to make sure that you know the reasoning behind it. And a lot of the time with critiques, as they call them, people just say, oh, this is what I think you should do. If you're giving a criticism, you have to actually be able to say why and also what would actually be the best solution. So it's all about analysis and solutions and being able to not leave somebody high and dry, but actually leave with a way forward so that they've got something to grasp onto.
And yet design is a public medium. Everyone has an opinion, often critical. Do you care about what other people think? And if someone criticizes your work, do you consider that a failure of sorts or no?
No, I think it is a matter of opinion. And, if somebody does do that, then you've come to a solution through a variety of questions. So you can explain why you've done something. A lot of questions are knee-jerk. People are only used to what they see in front of them, and our job is to reach out and get them to think outside that.
Have you learnt anything from others about failure?
Yes. Just being around and listening to different designers and what their ideas are and, what not to do. And a lot of the time it's from the business point of view. We had somebody would come to talk to the students about insurances, and it wasn't a failure on their point, but there was this contractor that was on site at Heathrow, and one of the builders' sandwich blew into the engine. Can you imagine the insurance on that? So it's not a failure, but it's being able to, anticipate what could go wrong.
So interesting, though, that you were saying that the one thing that you consider to be a failure is not being quite so good on the business side of things. And in a way, the point you're making now is similar, because it's almost disconnected from the process of design, but still an important part of the profession. Why are we still getting that wrong now? Do you think that we need to be embedding more practical skills into design education?
Definitely. I actually think that it goes back to kids coming out of school. The perception of an interior designer, everybody wants to be an interior designer, but nobody is stopping them and saying, look, it's actually quite a responsible and difficult profession. It has so many different arms. And I think that's one thing that I learned from, coming out of college, going in and working. You're not alerted to the actual process, even coming into a design practice. You're not part of the bigger picture of how the contracts work and how the insurances work and the fees. And a lot of practices, what happens is that a junior designer will be given a job, but they don't really, if they knew more, that you could only spend so many hours because that's all you've got, and the information is better, then it would be a much easier process. But when you're at college, you do not understand the relevance of it. So it's looking at, how the brief or whatever you're working on can be put into context with how it will work in practice, which is quite a difficult thing to do because, young designers are wanting to come up with ideas all the time, but the idea is only as good as making it happen.
Mix Interiors is the leading platform for commercial interior design and architecture, in print and online. We feature the people shaping and reshaping the world around us, explore the latest projects setting the bar for exceptional design, and showcase the products at the very forefront of innovation and creativity. For more information on how to subscribe in print or to view the latest digital content, head to mixinteriors.com. You've made design your life's work, Iris. So tell me, why does design matter?
Design is everywhere. The alarm goes off in the morning. The alarm clock's been designed. Everything that we touch, everywhere we go has been designed. And people do not recognise the fact that the process goes back that far. We've all got different tastes and trends, etc. But the quality of design is at the heart of it. And I think it's so important for people to recognise that.
You've seen those trends come and go, movements come and go. So what for you is good design?
Good design is almost like a classical approach to things in that you're recognising the building wherever it is, whatever it is, but you're designing with the building and the users in mind. It should have a longevity. A lot of residential interiors, there's a lot of trends around, but if you really think about something that you're going to be in a kitchen for the next 20 years, you want to make sure that it's going to work for you and you're going to enjoy the feeling of it. So I think the responsibility of the building, the actual visual design that comes out, it's been planted in the architecture and the building before we start. We had a conference in China through IFI years ago, and the Chinese conference asked all of the international representatives, which was worldwide, to stand up and talk about the trends of the country. Every one of us stood up and said, we don't believe in trends. We believe design should be thought about and actually taken from the heart of what the problem is, and therefore the trend doesn't exist.
Is there a particular trend that you would like to see banished to the annals of history? And perhaps something you would like to see come back again?
It's a really difficult one because, maximalism, it's not what I like at all. It's not my style, but then when you go into a space that's been done well and properly, you can see that it works. Whereas you can go into a similar style and somebody hasn't really understood the whole thing properly. So they haven't actually taken it the whole way.
There's a quote by a designer at Avrico that I once heard that said, there's no such thing as good and bad taste, just a lack of commitment.
And that's the same with any design. You have a framework that you're working to, and everything should actually fit into that.
And what have been some of the positive developments you've seen in the design industry as a whole?
Well, I think there's very much, with the London Design Festival and things that have been happening over the last 20 years, there's a lot more recognition. It's an amazingly large profession now. Developers are beginning to recognise that, you can't just titivate a design. You've got to actually listen and do something that makes a difference. And making a difference is really what needs to happen. And also this whole thing with not knocking down buildings, but actually bringing buildings back to life. Just walking around London, you see buildings that you just want to get your hands on and bring some life back into them. And that's not necessarily a trend. It's actually working with the ingredients that you've got.
Do you think it's because our values have changed slightly? So this interesting point about bringing buildings back to life, I think is often motivated through a drive for sustainability, for example, which is something that perhaps wasn't considered quite so much, even going back a decade, never mind 50 years.
Well, I did go to a talk that was on sustainability, and I stood up and said, I've got a few decades ahead of you guys. And when I was designing at university, at college, the word was appropriateness. It's not that things have changed, it's the language has changed. It's probably changed because it's more climate orientated, which is essential. And it's really good that it's come to the fore. But I think going back, your design guidance was always to take consideration of the whole building and if it was appropriate for the client.
And who it's used for. You once wrote that if you're designing a space that fits 300 people, it's down to us as designers to make sure that the space works for every single one of them. That really speaks to this notion of inclusive design. So tell me, Iris, how do you do that?
If you're designing a building of that size, the client has got to understand that you can't just dream something up. You've got to really understand how they work and who they communicate with and how the whole process is going through. And I remember years ago even asking a client for more information than they were willing to give. And they said, why do you need to know that? Well, we need to know about your business. We need to know how your business works in order to give you the design that's going to work for your business. So it's that analysis and thinking at the beginning and not just going into coming up with a quick solution.
And there's another line of yours that I found interesting. You've said that interior design professionals have got to recognize that our job is at the end of the line, which is why we have to ask the most questions. It feels personal. So why for you is design personal?
Getting back to that whole thing of are you comfortable where you are? Can you see properly? Design is there to actually make our lives better. And, you can't do that unless you actually understand what you're designing for and the building you're designing in and the environment that you want to create. So it's asking the questions. And I think that's something that a lot of the time the clients want things quickly, and therefore their speed sort of puts everybody off, because you don't stop and think and ask enough questions to get the right answers to be able to design properly.
In your experience, what are the questions that designers are still not asking that they should be?
It might be a little bit off-piste, this, but I do think that there should be more collaboration within our profession. Every business should have a design director. There should be design at the heart of every business, and there should be more recognition of design at government level. And I do believe that if key design practices can get together and actually push and make a difference, it's a constant thing with the design council, with everybody coming together.
What's that difference that you want to see?
The need for good design, the actual recognition that design as a word needs to be everywhere. It needs to be brought much more into education, into schools. It needs to be an everyday word. It seems to be very precious instead of actually being part of what we do.
Do you think that's because we see design as something aesthetic as opposed to design as something fundamental to how we live, how we navigate the world?
Yeah, and I think that it's seen as an extra as opposed to a fundamental need within everything. And just getting back to what I said about, you waking up and the alarm clock goes off. Design is everywhere, and it should be recognised as being everywhere. It should be sort of into everybody's DNA. And you can see that in Scandinavia, the difference between Scandinavia and Britain. I don't know why, but they seem to think more design than we do. So I think just pushing and pushing, not stopping before everybody understands the importance.
So now we know a little bit about what you've learned across your 5-decade career. If there was one lesson that you would want someone listening to this to take away, what would it be?
I think be considerate. Don't see design as an extra. See it as a fundamental to your life and to the job that you do. It's not just a job, it's part of us. And be considerate to everyone, I think.
Well, it's been a really terrific conversation, Iris. I've really enjoyed it, and you've taught me a few things.
Oh, good.
But I think my greatest takeaway is this notion that creativity belongs to everyone, because I think that is absolutely at the heart of inclusive design. I also love your philosophy on failure, that actually failure can be used as a tool to push us onto a different path, but that maybe that different path is the right one, the one that we were meant to be on all along. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Things I've Learned. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you like and subscribe to the podcast and recommend us to your friends. Join us again next time for the season finale, when I'll be speaking with Starchitect Patrick Schumacher, principal at Zaha Hadid Architects. We also film these conversations, so if you want to see us as well as hear us, head over to our website, mixinteriors.com. Things I've Learned is hosted by me, Harry McKinley. This episode was produced by Nada Smiljanic, and the executive producer was Dan Jackson, with original music by Memotone. Things I've Learned is a co-production by Reduced Listening and Mix Interiors.